Okay, so here's the carburetor body itself. You have the fuel feed into the bottom, comes into the float bowl. The float will obviously keep the fluid the right height, it then feeds into the bottom of the carburetor and it gets drawn in through the normal jet system. The float bowl itself has just got a screw on the top of it to pull it out. This is the tickler. It should be a spring. You see that's stuck there, so I'm not happy with that because that should automatically pop back up again. When you're taking this off, before you unscrew this, you have to undo this bolt here, and I'll show you why. So that has to be unscrewed first of all. It doesn't need to come all the way out, it just needs to be loose. And then the top should unscrew. It's typical of a lot of carburetors at the time, but it can cause problems if you don't remove that, and I'll show you why. Let's pop it back up again nicely. I don't know if I can probably show you this, but I'll try to give you a view. There's a saw cut through the side of it, and when you tighten this nut here, it actually pulls these threads up tight. So you screw it in normally, and then when it's in there you tighten this just a tiny little bit and it causes the threads to bind, which means this then can't loosen. It's a way of locking this in place. This is the tickler at the top, and in fact it is working nicely. So there's a nice spring there. You can see there's a little collet that holds the unit together, but that seems to be working okay, so I need to investigate the float and see what the problem is in there. The float itself is a bottom feed, so you'll see there's a needle that gets pushed down, and I want to make sure that the float can come up and down, which it can. However, I have to remove that separately. I can take I'll start off with, I'll take the unit off the carburetor itself. So in here will be a feed system. You can see there's a thing there with holes in it, and then you'll see the jet itself, and it says there, I think you can see on it, he says, hopefully, turning it right up, I think you can see it says there, it's a 115 jet. We need to make sure that jet is clean, and we need to make sure that the fuel height in the bottom of the bowl is correct to make sure that this is always submerged in fuel to allow the carburation system to work. So the needle will go into here, and this will act as the feed, and the tapered needle as it goes through here will then control the amount of fluid that comes out until it gets out to a certain portion, when the needle has no impact on the emulsion tube, and the thing that restricts the flow is the size of this jet here. This is the main jet. So we obviously need to make sure this main jet feeds enough fuel into this tube to allow the needle to work. So that's the standard system that you'd expect in any carburetor. The next part is to do with the slow running jet, and this is this part here. This is it's a strange little piece, and you can see this, the top part is floats and there's a little hole inside of it, and what it allows it to do is it's always fed by fuel from the float here, from this device. This sits at the bottom, and obviously this is the part that keeps the main jet full of fuel all the time. There's actually a hole in the bottom of here, and you can see, hopefully you can see that hole there. That feeds into this chamber here, and that allows, when this gets screwed in, fuel is drawn up into the venturi when there is a low pressure on the engine side, which is increased. That low pressure is increased when the slide is closed. So when you've got the slide closed and the engine's trying to run, it is sucking air out of here, and what it does then is it draws fuel through this section here and into the venturi. So that's what that allows it to do. When the engine is running quickly, the low pressure in this section of the carburetor is even lower, and it actually draws this piece up. I'll see if I can make it move up so you can see it a little bit clearer. It'll actually pull it up like that, and it pulls it up so that the tapered section on the top sits onto a seat, and therefore it stops drawing any more fuel into the body, and this section of the carburetor then becomes superfluous, and therefore you're running on the needle, the emulsion tube, and then on the main jet. When the slide goes back down again, this then drops down and then allows the slow running jet fuel to come back out through this section here. So that's that part. The other piece is this device here. It's got a little needle on the end of it, I think you can see, and that screws into the side of this port here. And what that does is, this is the mixture screw, And this is also fed from the fuel portion that's sitting in this body here. So the fuel is drawn up from here into this body, and there's yet another hole. I think you might be able to see it. It says hopefully in the bottom of that, in the body there. And what this does is this then controls the amount of free fuel that is then allowed to be drawn into the engine. So if you're running it lean or you're running it a bit rich, you can adjust the amount of fuel that is being fed into the engine at any point in time through this device here. So that screws into the side of the carb body, and it's got a spring in it, so you can set it at any point that you want. So that's the main parts of a carburettor like this. And what you just need to do is you just need to make sure all those ports are clear, that they feed from each other, and there's no crud in it. I can see when I look at the bottom of the body there's a lot of crud at the bottom where the slide guide, I'm sure there's a proper name for this, but where this sits, there's a lot of crud at the bottom, which means that the slide isn't being able to get right down to the bottom of the carb. Some work to do. Okay, so I've now removed the fuel feed from the bottom of the float bowl by taking this nut off. Make sure that all the seals are replaced when you put it all back together again. And before I do anything different, I'm going to just check to see this works. So because it's a bottom feed, the fuel will come into here, and when the float is down with gravity, you should hear air going through here and into the float bowl. So I'm going to try and do that now. And indeed it works. The next part is that when the float is at full height, the next part is that if there's fuel in here, I should be able to blow into here and hear it coming out of this hole at the side. So I'm going to block the other holes and blow in through the top. And yes, there's obviously communication with the area where the jet sits. The next part is to blow in at the bottom and then check to see that the fuel cuts off when I lift the float bowl. So that proves to me that the float valve works. The next thing I need to do is to make sure that the float actually floats. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some petrol in here and make sure that the float moves up and down and there's no holes in the float. Okay, so let me try now and explain some of the components of the carburettor to you in this particular model. So if we start with the emulsion tube and the jets, this is the device that goes into the lower part of the body here, and this goes in and actually secures the bottom part of the slide guide, and that basically fits into the unit like this. This acts as a conduit to basically keep this part in place, and there's a pin there to stop it from rotating within the body, and there's a slide here, a little groove that should stop the brass slide that you saw earlier from rotating. And clearly there's a pin missing on that brass slide. That's something I'll need to fix. This then also acts as a support for the next section. This part fits in like this, and this screws into the main body. This is the emulsion tube, and the needle fits into here so that the needle will act in that hole.